You are listening to the Norton Library Podcast, where we explore classic works of literature and philosophy with the leading scholars of the Norton Library, a new series from W.W. Norton that introduces influential texts to a new generation of readers. I'm your host, Mark Chirino, with Michael Von Cannon producing. Today we present the first of our 2 episodes devoted to Homer's Odyssey as we interview its translator, Emily Wilson. In this episode, we discuss the Homeric question, the structure of the narrative, Odysseus as a complicated protagonist, the role of women in the poem, the interaction between humans and gods, and much more. Emily Wilson is professor of classical studies and graduate chair of the program in comparative literature and literary theory at the University of Pennsylvania. Among her many publications are critically acclaimed translations of Euripides, Sophocles, and Seneca. In addition to the Odyssey, she has published translations of Oedipus Tyrannus and the Iliad for the Norton Library, and she has been good enough to join us on the Norton Library Podcast to discuss both of those wonderful publications. It's always great when she joins us. Emily Wilson, welcome back to the Norton Library Podcast.
It's great to talk to you again.
Good to see you again, Emily. It's not too often that a classicist can claim her title is in the popular news. This must be an exciting summer for you.
It's really weird, honestly. I mean, I hadn't predicted it because I'm an idiot, and yeah, it's really weird. I'm having a 2 seconds of fame.
Of course, your Norton Library edition with your introduction, and that's actually where I wanted to start. You referred to something called the Homeric question, which is actually a sequence of questions that seem to be fundamental in how we approach the poem. Can you talk about that a little bit for us?
Yes, so the capital H, capital Q, Homeric question, and as you say, it's actually multiple questions. It's questions about how did these monumental written poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, come into being in writing? How were they composed? Given that we know that before the mid-8th century, the Greek-speaking world had no reading or writing for several hundred years. We know that the Iliad and the Odyssey are based on this long, pre-existing, purely oral, poetic, mythical tradition. And yet, these poems are composed using this new technology of writing. How exactly did it happen? Was it one individual who drew on this long pre-existing tradition to write down the mega director's cut of these pre-existing traditions? Was it somebody who dictated to a scribe? Because, of course, usually oral poets is actually quite a separate kind of training from the work of a writer. Or was it a collaboration, and was it the same person who composed the Iliad and the Odyssey, given that the poems are clearly extremely complementary and yet they don't overlap with each other? So are they different poets as well as different narratives, different worlds? Those questions and versions of those questions, and then ongoing further questions about to what extent were the poems as they were created, composed using writing in the 7th century, how much variation was there when they were rhapsodic texts used to learn the poems by heart by rhapsodes who were then performing them out loud? Were their poems fixed in their finished form already in the 7th or 6th century, or were they still undergoing various changes over the next several hundred years until the time of the Homeric scholars, Library of Alexandria, like 3rd century?
When you say the Odyssey and the Iliad are complementary texts, are you saying that thematically or historically or also linguistically, so it is plausible that the same human being could have composed both works?
All of the above. They're definitely in the same language, though the vocabulary is somewhat different, but of course it would be because there's more eyeball spearing in the Iliad and there's more banqueting and bathing and hosting in the Odyssey. So you need different words to describe different kinds of scenes. They're complementary in their stories. The Iliad is set during the Trojan War. The Odyssey is set after the Trojan War. Both of them have a Greek protagonist who's very separated from his male peers, his comrades, and who's on this journey in the course of the long poem to reclaim his honor at the risk of his own life. So that narrative is in both poems, but plays out in very, very different ways. Both of these poems have a goddess who's sort of pushing or guiding the plot. In the case of the Odyssey, it's Athena. So there are ways that they're clearly matching each other and also set in very, very different worlds. There's this claustrophobic intensity to the Iliad in its focus on the battlefield at Troy and the besieged city, whereas the Odyssey is set all over a mythical version of the Mediterranean.
Emily, your introduction refers to Homer, and then you say, if there was such a person, which is pretty tantalizing. This is because of the historical impossibility to have definitive proof. Do you have a sense one way or the other, or through the centuries has popular critical opinion landed one way or the other? Is it like a cyclical understanding of who this person might have been?
I think there's still quite a lot of ambiguity and scholarly debate. I mean, the scholarly consensus is that these poems are more or less the first works of written Greek literature. I mean, in contrast to earlier scholarly views that there were earlier drafts of these poems or bits of these poems that were then cobbled together, patched together in something the same way that the Hebrew Bible was patched together out of pre-existing written sources. That's not how the Iliad and the Odyssey were composed. But I don't actually think that unless we have a time machine, can we know whether it was one person or a couple of people collaborating or some group of people. I actually don't think we can fully know that. I think we can tell that both the Odyssey and the Iliad have a really coherent monumental architecture in their plot. There's a real design to this. There's an intentionality to this, which I think shows that if it was more than one person, they were working together very closely. But that doesn't actually prove it had to be a single genius.
So this design that you're describing, it seems like there are multiple plots. And if you look at Penelope or Odysseus or Telemachus, each of them have kind of a separate motivation and a journey that each of them are taking. Is this common, that there doesn't seem to be a central unity in one arc? Is that a surprising thing from this era?
I mean, all we have from this era is the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the poems of Hesiod, and then the slightly later Hesiodic catalogues, Shield, or other archaic Greek poetry is slightly later than this. So it's not like we can do a full assessment of these are the norms of dactylic hexameter poetry when we have such a small sample size. But the sophistication and nesting and braiding of the narrative that you get in both the Odyssey and you get that in the Odyssey, you also get it in the Iliad. But I think I would dispute the idea that because there's this nesting of stories within stories, and we get, as you say, the journey of Telemachus before we get the journey of Odysseus, we get this sense of the son is moving towards the father in circles, the father is moving towards the son, the wife, mother is moving up and down stairs. There are these movements and stories within stories. But does that mean we don't have a coherent narrative? I think it very much doesn't mean that. I think it will very much shown in the first few lines of the poem that this is going to be about nostos. So this ancient Greek word, which means a journey home from war. That word, home, homecoming, home, is repeated in the first lines of the poem. So we're cued into, this is about the homecoming. What does the homecoming mean? Who has a homecoming? What does one man's homecoming? How does it reflect on the lack of homecoming of other characters? Once Odysseus is back on Ithaca, how does his homecoming impact everyone else in his household, including the suitors, but also including wife, son, enslaved members of the household, even the dog? There's a really clear thematic and narrative unity to the poem, despite its narrative sophistication and diversity.
And so what does that home mean to Penelope? I know that your introduction, you talk a lot about women in the poem and how fascinating, what a variety of female characters are in the poem. What about Penelope's entrance into that theme of home?
Yeah, I mean, I think we see Penelope as somebody who cares a great deal about her home. I mean, one of the ways that she repeatedly frames the choice that faces her of should she marry one of the suitors, give up on waiting for her 20 years absent husband, and then go off somewhere else. But then would that jeopardize her own glory? Would that jeopardize the well-being of her son? And that would also mean losing her house. That the only way that she can stay in this house that she's very much attached to is by postponing this period of waiting and waiting and waiting. So I think we have a clear sense of Penelope as somebody who cares about her home and wants as far as possible to manage her home. And that we also have a sense that she has limited power over her household, though she also has far more power over the household that belongs to her than do the women and men whom she enslaves.
One of the things that I imagine a new reader of the Odyssey would have to juggle is that the world of the poem has men and women and animals and gods and goddesses too. What is the world that Homer is constructing about the interaction of all of these figures? Is this representative of the thought of this type of society, or is this some kind of an imaginative universe? How should we think about this?
The central books of the poem, which are the ones that if you just read a kid's retelling of the Odyssey, you may well read primarily a sequence that takes up only a very small minority of the actual poem's narrative, which is the part when we get to hear about how does Odysseus leave the goddess Calypso, arrive on the island of Scheria, the home of the Phaeacians, and then he tells this tall traveller's tale about how he encountered human-eating giants and these various goddesses, some friendly, some not so much so. So it evokes this world that is both, on some level, parts of it are realistic, but parts of it are clearly fantastical. So I think it's important just in terms of historical context, which I think is part of what your question is getting at. The archaic Greek period was a time of, after these many centuries of illiteracy, of scattered small populations across the Greek-speaking world. This was a time of massive population boom, of colonization and diaspora migration of Greek speakers from quote-unquote Greece to all over the Greek-speaking world. So there were Greek colonies in, for instance, Sicily, in southern Italy, which was called Magna Graecia, all over the Mediterranean coast, and in place where what we call Turkey. So these questions of how do Greek speakers relate to non-Greek speakers was a real live issue in the archaic period and is, of course, a theme in the poem. And then I think the second essential historical background thing is that combined with this population increase and diaspora, this was also a time of urbanization, but urbanization and conglomeration of Greek-speaking communities where the people in power weren't necessarily related to each other, so it's moving out beyond the household. But some Greek-speaking communities were ruled by a single man, some were ruled by a plurality of men, like an oligarchy. So the poem is also really engaged with, do we want one man who just makes it back home, he's the boss, he's the leader, or do we want shared power? The multiple suitors, the multiple comrades of Odysseus. Do we want multiplicity, or do we want just one guy who's the guy?
A couple of more specific questions about all of this interaction. I'm looking at book 2 of your translation, where Telemachus is told, "You will achieve the journey that you seek, since I will go with you." And I think in any other narrative, you'd be like, oh, well, then that's basically telling us what is going to happen if you have a god on your side. Where's the tension? Is that a misreading of it? Is that meant to comfort the reader just like it comforts Telemachus, or is it more complex than that?
I think we need to remember that Athena is an extremely powerful deity, but she's not the only deity, right? I mean, that this is a world both of issues of sharing power that happen on the mortal realm and that also happen on the divine realm. It might well be that Athena's plans, even though she's sure of her plans and she has great plans, she's really good at planning, but her plans could be foiled or delayed by, for instance, Poseidon, who has different views about how Odysseus and his son whether or not he wants them to get home safely. So I think there's both a sense of, we kind of know where this narrative is going. Telemachus probably will get back safe, but I don't think that takes away all the narrative tension of the suitors are going to try to ambush Telemachus. They were going to try and kill him. And we might have at least some period of thinking, what if this goes the wrong way? And we kind of know, but we might also be questioning what this could go horribly wrong. And then similarly, we have repeated prophecies to Odysseus from both Circe and the Theban prophet Tiresias, whom he meets in the land of the dead. And those are quite typical of Homeric prophecy in that surely they're reliable, prophecy comes true, but also they're bipartite. Either Odysseus and all his men will get home as long as they don't eat the cattle of the sun, or else they eat the cattle of the sun, Odysseus will have a very belated, very horrible, painful journey home after being shipwrecked, and all his men will die. So it's not like prophecy says this will happen. Prophecy can very often say there's a fork in the path, and at least two different things could happen, which also generates narrative tension, right? We know this is going to be a really important moment because it has been prophesied.
And maybe this example also refers to the last 2 points both about women and the supernatural, the episodes with Calypso, but also Circe, who have supernatural power over Odysseus. Take somebody like Circe, who has the power to turn men into swine. Is this some kind of a universal symbol that we're supposed to get? Why does she have this power?
I mean, she's a goddess. I would not put either one of these under the label of women. They're not women. They're goddesses, right? They're divine, and that's really clear in the poem that they're, in contrast to the movie, right? I don't think that's clear at all. But they're definitely divine, immortal beings. The figure of Calypso may well have been made up by whoever composed the Odyssey as this sort of parallel to Circe, to give us a place that Odysseus can have been trapped or hidden as the no-name hero before he gets on the quest to win back his eternal name among the world of human beings, of mortals. I think both of these passages, both of these episodes, the Circe and the Calypso episode, show us the dangers of being subsumed or hidden or contained by some other place, some other home. I mean, which of course is an anxiety for any migrant or immigrant or emigrant. Right? What if I assimilate too much with some other place and I lose who I used to be? So they're partly about that. And then also these ways that Circe in particular is this really interestingly ambivalent figure, whereby she's never actually shown having a bacon sandwich, right? Which I think is really important, that she turns humans into foodstuffs, but she also offers all of this help to Odysseus. So she's on this cusp between, is she a threat and a potential eater in the way that Scylla and Charybdis and Polyphemus and the Laestrygonians are, or is she actually closer to the way that both Calypso and Ino, the white goddess, and Athena are these tutelary deities? They're keeping safe the male protagonist as he goes on his quest.
Is there a female character in the poem that you like to discuss in terms of representing the complexity of this poem's portrayal?
I feel like we've touched a little bit on many of them. Maybe we should do a shout out to Eurycleia, who's the old enslaved woman whom we're told was bought by Laertes, Odysseus' father. So she's been in the household for a very long time. So she has this sort of intimate connection with the body of Odysseus because she's taken care of him when he was a child. She knows, therefore, the scar on his leg. I think there's something really fascinating about the fact that it's Eurycleia who recognizes Odysseus by a physical marker when she's washing his leg, and then realizes he's got that scar. I know that scar. And then we have this amazing backstory where she's remembering how he got the scar. It was from his first hunting trip when he went to stay with his grandfather and encountered a boar that was almost as stubborn as Odysseus himself will become in the boar's defensiveness. So Odysseus got his leg gouged, and Eurycleia is able, by feeling the leg, to realize that's that same young man, that boy, that child, that he's here. Eurycleia is presented as parallel to the other old enslaved character, the swineherd Eumaeus. So inside the house, we have the female lead slave, who's Eurycleia. Outside the house, we have the swineherd Eumaeus, each of whom are protecting the enslaver's property until he'll come back home, which he does.
Emily, let's talk about Odysseus for a few minutes, if we could. And I want to start right from the first line of your translation. Tell me about a complicated man. That adjective, complicated, has turned out to be pretty charged over the last year or so. So is that adjective something that your translation introduced it to the language of the Odyssey, or has that been a common way to begin the poem?
So the original poem begins Andra moi enne per musa polutropon. So polutropos, that epithet applied to Odysseus, has been translated dozens of different ways by the dozens of different translators. There isn't a standard way to translate it. If you look that word up in a dictionary, complicated actually appears among many other possible definitions. There isn't really a single word that exactly corresponds to it, but actually that's the case for every word.
Yeah.
It's not like this is special in that particular way. People fixate on it, though.
No, I've read previous translations where they have a description of something that is complicated, but without that exact word, about a complicated man. And the intriguing thing to me about that adjective is I'm not sure if it's a neutral statement or if it's a compliment. Does it have some sort of tendency one way or the other?
I wanted to pick an English word that would have some neutrality and or ambivalence, because this is actually quite a rare word. It's only used twice in Homer. Odysseus has many other epithets, which is like the standard repeated adjectives used to describe Homeric characters. He's much more often described as polymetis, so meaning crafty or much scheming, or mechanos, meaning good at problem-solving strategy, or polyklas, meaning resilient or stubborn. He's very rarely described by this word. And I think, therefore, that whoever composed this poem is making a really marked choice to define this character in this unusual way in that first line, and hint, I would argue, at both something twisty, turny, layered, multiple about the character and also about the poem you're about to encounter and the journey. So I wanted not to use a translation that wouldn't be able to suggest there's something about this narrative as well as something about this guy, because I think that's part of what is being hinted at in the original. And I also, as a translator, especially with my Odyssey translation, I want to prioritize the rapidity as well as the vividness of the original, which means I want, if possible, not to translate a single word by 10 different words, which is what many translators do.
I think it's more common to refer to somebody, as you're describing, as complex than complicated. But complex may have a psychological suggestion that you might not have wanted to engage in.
Right. I think the original term conveys both these layers or twists or turns in Odysseus's character, but also in how he appears. So as in the word trope, right, there's a connotation of the multiple disguises that he's going to assume. So it's not necessarily primarily about an internal quality. It's about who is he going to present himself as. And whoever meets him may meet a different Odysseus, because he may be telling a different story and wearing a different guise. And I actually don't think that that's conveyed quite as... I don't think either of these English words fully conveys that, but I think complicated gets closer to it than complex does. And also complex man wouldn't scan. Because one of my primary qualities...
That's important, yeah.
...agenda is, this is a poem. I do not want to create a translation of a metrical poem that doesn't use traditional meter, so I need to have a light beat if it's going to be followed by man.
The Norton Library podcast generally avoids spoilers, but in a discussion of Odysseus and how complicated he is, I'm interested in the note that the poem leaves us on, because in the end, it seems like if we're expecting some kind of a noble hero, courageous, stalwart, all this, it seems like he has a tendency towards violence.
I mean, that's part of being brave, right? He's very brave in battle, and that's one of his comfort zones, is being in battle. So, I mean, unlike the film, which doesn't take us back to the Odysseus at war, the original poem takes us from, I mean, this is part of what I was suggesting about, there is a really clear structure despite all the meanderings of the Odyssey. In the first couple of lines, what we learn about Odysseus is he's complicated, and we're meeting him after he's sacked a holy city. At the very end of the poem, he's on the point of slaughtering all his neighbors on Ithaca, and he's stopped from doing so as he's swooping like an eagle to slaughter more people by Athena. I mean, I'm not sure that the poem is suggesting there's something inglorious about this. I think the poem has been tracing all of the different ways that Odysseus can win glory. He can win glory by his wiliness, and he can manage to survive when nobody else could possibly survive. He can win glory by his skill in storytelling and his capacity to make up multiple stories and problem solve. But he can also win glory by slaughtering people, which is the usual way that a Homeric warrior gains glory.
Speaking of that, Emily, I remember one of the main things I remember about the Odyssey when I read it in ninth grade, back when it was contemporary literature. And I know that you normally teach to graduate students and undergraduates rather than ninth graders, but I was really thrown by the word suitors. Mm-hmm. And I felt that the slaughtering at the end of the poem was an outsized reaction. Mm-hmm. Are we to think of these guys as rapacious and violating, and they do get what they deserve at the end of the poem?
That's so interesting. You know, I went to the film with my teenagers, and my 15-year-old learned the word suitors, which she did not know before. So it's great to build your vocabulary through reading and cinema. I love that. I think both things can be true, right? I mean, I think it can be true that the suitors of Penelope are certainly presented as rapacious. And the poem's language repeatedly invites us to think there's a way that they are cannibal adjacent, because they're repeatedly described as devouring the livelihood of Odysseus and Telemachus. The word is biotos. It's like life, as in biology. It's a cognate word with that. So it's as if they're on the point of eating Odysseus and Telemachus themselves by eating all of their food and drinking all their wine. And of course they try to ambush and slaughter Telemachus, but are foiled in doing so. So it's not like they're presented as, these are super nice guys who did nothing wrong whatsoever. The poem is very, very much interested in how guests can violate the norms of hospitality, for instance, by entering somebody's home uninvited and eating their food uninvited. Of course, Odysseus and his men enter Polyphemus' home uninvited, but the suitors have entered Odysseus' home uninvited, not cool. But Odysseus is also not a great host, right? And if we're thinking about the norms, it goes both ways in this poem. A host who kills his guest, also not great hosting. And I think it really matters that the poem doesn't just leave us with, then they were dead, Odysseus reunited with his wife, awesome, love it. But that in book 24, we get to see the grief of their fathers. And then we get the speeches of the Ithacans who say, this man has done outrageous wrongs. He left Ithaca with these multiple ships full of young men to Troy. None of them came back. That's actually not a good, glorious thing within the world of the Homeric poems. A leader is supposed to generate glory by having at least some of his men survive after the sack of a city. Odysseus doesn't do that.
That element was quite interesting to me, too, about Odysseus as a leader and how his men would have felt about him. Is he a good friend? Is that also a complicated aspect of his character?
It's a complex aspect of the poem's world building. I talked already about how in the archaic world, there were some Greek communities where power sharing between men who were not kin was a thing. Oligarchy was a thing. It was like on the cusp of the development of democracies in the Greek-speaking world. So I don't think we should sort of assume, of course, these men are subordinates. They should just know their place. They shouldn't be constantly challenging Odysseus. In the sequence of Odysseus and his men's wanderings, we get these repeated tropes of the men challenging Odysseus' authority, but also challenging his right to be the only one who gets spoils and gets glory from Troy, right? I mean, the whole Aeolus episode where Eurylochus insists on opening the bag of the winds because he thinks Odysseus has been hoarding resources, all of the gold and silver that we fought and risked our lives for at Troy. That guy's taking it all for himself. Let's not let him get away with that. And similarly, the choice to eat the cattle of the sun, it's a heroic choice. It's a choice to challenge the idea that the men just have to be subordinate characters. And of course, both of those choices are deadly for the men who don't get to be subordinate characters within this poem where the narrative is guided by Athena, who prefers Odysseus. But I don't think we're necessarily invited to think they're unambiguously wrong to want that.
Emily, I'd like to ask you just one more question for this episode. I realize that we're kind of coming full circle because we talked about the complexity of the narrative, the multifaceted narrative, and we haven't really addressed Telemachus. Is there a lens through which we can just view this as a coming-of-age story from Telemachus, and Telemachus is the protagonist in that sense?
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely one of the protagonists, and there's this sort of parallel story of the father and the son coming together. I mean, I think the poem is sort of interesting about that, right? Because it's really clear that Telemachus, and when we first meet him in books 1 and 2, is anxious about not fully inhabiting the social role of being the man of the household, the king of the neighboring estates. Instead, he's on the cusp of social maturity, but he's not fully there yet. And he goes on his own little mini journey, his Telemachy, in books 3 and 4 to meet his father's peers and colleagues, which is, I mean, a part of the problem for Telemachus is that he is, like Odysseus, an only child, the only son of an only son. He has no beneficial peers, no brothers. So he's sort of looking for, where is my community, which is part of what it means to be able to be an adult man and have power in the world. This is a poem about time, about turning back time, and also about whether time can be stopped or turned back. Telemachus goes on this journey towards manhood, but if Telemachus is fully grown up, then what's Odysseus going to do? If Odysseus is going to be the top guy in the household, then in some ways Telemachus kind of has to stay frozen in time. So I think there's this sort of ambiguity about, are we leaving Odysseus and Telemachus at this moment of, it's great, they're back together, all three of them are fighting together, and then is Odysseus going to stick around and then Telemachus can never grow up? Or is Odysseus going to go off in exile? Who knows?
In our episode about Oedipus, we were talking about, is there something fundamental about the search for the lost father, just in terms of narrative? Is that some sort of essential narrative that this poem is asking us to think about?
I sort of have limited sympathy for the Jungian or universal tropes ways of reading the Odyssey or other literature, but I do think that the theme of fraught relationships between fathers and sons very much runs through both archaic and classical Greek literature, and also that theme relates to how this is a poem about time. I mean, the cattle of the sun number the days of the year. Odysseus is sort of echoing being the sun god when he comes back and slaughters the suitors and takes control of time. But then to be a father has this sort of question about, when does the father give way to the son? And I think that question is in some ways fascinatingly unresolved by the end of the Odyssey.
Emily Wilson, thank you so much for joining us on the Norton Library podcast.
Thank you.
The Norton Library edition of Homer's Odyssey, translated by Emily Wilson, is available now in paperback and ebook. Check out the links in the description to this episode for ordering options and more information about the Norton Library, including the full catalog of titles.